Hi everyone, it's Michian. Today we're going to do a lecture on one of the major pieces of imperialism, which was called the Scramble for Africa, or the European colonization of African territories. So I'd like you to go ahead and take notes on this. Remember, you don't need to write down every single word, but definitely write down what you think is important. Okay, let me share my screen with you. Okay. So the scramble for Africa begins around 1870 and lasts until the start of the First World War in 1914. All right, so a couple of key terms, and definitely write these down, they're just like vocabulary. So we can formally define the scramble for Africa as a period in which Europeans divided up and conquered the African continent. Lasted from 1870 to 1914, but really peaked in 1884 to 1895. And then the formal conference where they sat down and divided up Africa was the Berlin Conference, which happened in 1884 in Berlin, Germany. And that was a meeting at which European powers decided who would have which territories. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so it's important to remember that before European domination, Africa, which is a huge continent, had hundreds of ethnic and language groups. Millions of people lived there, very diverse societies from Northern Africa all the way down to Southern Africa and Madagascar. Most of Africa at this time was ruled by relatively small kingdoms, rarely more than 100,000 people. There were some larger kingdoms like the Mali Empire and the Zulus in the south, but most empires were fairly small. Northern Africa, especially Egypt, had long been ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and there were many wealthy city-states along the eastern African coast that participated in Indian Ocean trade. Um, so there were a lot of very independent, wealthy empires and city-states in Africa. And in the early 1800s, the Zulu Empire began to expand across southern Africa in kind of a similar domination to the way that European empires had begun to expand across like Latin and South America. So they definitely had their own internal struggles and empires and conquests and things like that. So while Europeans and Africans had had contact for about 400 years at this point, really began trading with each other around the 1400s, African resistance to European colonization, the difficult and dangerous terrain and geography of Africa, including deserts and jungles and mountains and things like that, as well as diseases, kept Europeans really from expanding their countries into the interior of the continent. There were certainly like European outposts, like we talked about, the Portuguese had like trading posts along sort of the Horn of Africa there, but no European country really owned large chunks of Africa. But two things really made a difference in that, and that was powered steamships that could now sail up the African rivers without depending on wind. They could use coal and steam and things like that, as well as medical advances and understanding of how to prevent and treat things like malaria. And those made it possible for Europeans to begin to explore the interior of Africa around the 1850s. And so at this point, there begins this big surge of especially Christian European missionaries and explorers that begin to travel to Africa to try and convert Africans to Christianity, which was another part of what was called the white man's burden, which we talked about last week. Right? And this really led to a surge of European missionaries and explorers who were kind of the first wave of European domination in Africa. Okay, so these two maps are comparing African territories in 1880 versus African territories in 1913. So you can see here that there's lots of different ones, fairly small. Egypt probably has the biggest here, which was technically owned by the Ottoman Empire, right? France owns Algeria, and then there's all these independent African kingdoms as well. And you can see by 1913, so really just within 30 years, these African empires have been dissolved and consolidated into these huge chunks of what was now European territory, including the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, the German Empire, as well as Belgium. Right? So that's what we're looking at here, this shift from the continent owned mostly by the people who live there and controlled mostly by the people who live there versus the continent controlled almost entirely by Europeans. Okay, so European presence in Africa was growing with these missionaries and explorers, and and Europeans, I should say, begin to realize that Africa has a lot of resources. And Europe was concerned by the threat of a European war starting from competition to access European or African markets and resources. And Germany becomes a new nation. It unites a big chunk of Europe under the German banner in 1870. And they decide to start an empire in Africa. And so the rest of Europe is concerned that Germany is going to take over all of Africa, and that will give them too much power in Europe. So, what the European countries decide to do is to meet to settle what they call the problem of Africa. And basically, they do exactly what's in this picture here. They essentially sit down and decide which European country has claim to which territory. And you should note that there was no African leader or person present at this conference, at the Berlin Conference. It was all European countries, leaders sitting down and literally drawing lines on a map. And no Africans were given the right to own their own country, to own the pieces of land that they had lived on for thousands of years, right? It was just basically like Europeans said, we have the right to this territory and we're going to take it. And it doesn't matter what the people who actually live there want. So Britain came out of this as a big winner. They get almost 1/3 of the continent, including South Africa here, as well as Egypt, right, and Nigeria, and some smaller countries there. So they're all the blue on here. France also took large territories. They're the red, although a lot of this territory here is taken up by the Sahara Desert and is not really livable or workable. Right? And these territories would be sold off to companies in Britain and France for mining, timber, and coaling projects, as well as things like gold mining, diamond mining, rubber, etc. And very little, almost none of the money gained by those British and French and European companies would stay in Africa, which is one of the reasons that a lot of Africa is very impoverished in the present, is that all this money continues to flow out of Africa into the West or into Asia. So it's important to remember that the borders of Africa were drawn at Berlin with very little or almost no knowledge of the regions that they were dividing up. It was pretty much done based on what resources were there and what territory the European countries wanted. So it didn't matter what people lived there, or if they hated each other, or if there were, different ethnic or language or religious groups, right? That didn't matter to the Europeans. And a lot of these borders that were drawn at the Berlin Conference are still used today, which is one of the things that leads to a lot of conflict and instability in African countries, because there's these like historical differences between these different groups of people that were forced to live in the same country and work together. And as you can probably guess, that was really bad for the Africans. One of the particular atrocities of the Scramble for Africa was what's called the Belgian Congo. So, King Leopold of Belgium took individual personal control of the Congo, which is an area in Central Africa, in 1876, right before the Berlin Conference. And it didn't belong to Belgium, the country. It literally personally belonged to Leopold himself. So, this king owned this huge swath of territory in Central Africa. And he used the Congo as essentially a huge private slave plantation to farm rubber from rubber trees to then he could sell to European companies who needed rubber for their industries. So this was basically a huge slave profit making machine for King Leopold. And he instituted there an extremely brutal, violent regime. He would hold women and children hostage to force men to work. He would cut off the hands and feet of people who did not deliver their rubber quota, et cetera, et cetera. Like he did some definitely, he and the people who worked for him did some really horrible atrocities there. And I think now it's considered genocide. And because at least 10 million Congolese died during his reign in the Congo. And he controlled that area from 1876 to 1908 when journalists uncovered these atrocities and forced Leopold to turn over the Congo to the Belgian government. So it didn't go back to the Congolese or the people who lived there, it just went over to the Belgian government. So it was a little more fairly and not as horribly run. And you'll read a little bit more about this tomorrow, since it's one of the major atrocities in Africa committed by the Europeans. Okay, so there were two free countries in Africa. And so by 1914, only Ethiopia, which is in Eastern Africa, and Liberia, which is on the western coast of Africa, remained free from European control. Liberia was actually a colony of the United States that was begun by freed American slaves who had basically said, we want to go back to Africa and start our own country there. And so President Monroe gave them permission to, and they established their own country, which is why English is the national language of Liberia, because it started out as as an American colony. So technically, it wasn't an independent country either. Ethiopia remained the only truly independent African-run country on the continent, and that was largely due to their having a very strong leader, Menelik II, whose picture is right here, and they had a very strong army that used modern weapons. And they defeated Italy in a couple of different battles, which was a huge humiliation for Italy, as you can imagine, and it was a huge motivator for a lot of African resistance to European colonization, which we'll look at later this week. So by 1914, there were only really two independent African countries, and really only one that was run by Africans and by the people who lived there. Okay, so that is the basis of the Scramble for Africa. We'll continue to look at it more this week. And again, if you have any questions, you can always email me or leave a comment on our teams. All right, guys, I hope you're having a good day. Bye.